All right, cool. So let me move on to not only what to look for in an apprentice, but how to develop an apprentice. So let's say this person said yes. I mean, they're crazy. They've somehow, in an insane way, thought that this sounds like a really good idea. And so they become an apprentice to yourself, and they begin to meet with you on a regular basis. And what I would suggest is that when you invite somebody into apprenticeship, it's a little bit of an art. And then there's also a little bit of a science to it. And oftentimes we'll use the analogy of a bicycle to kind of describe that. That what we would say is that when it came to you learning how to ride a bike, if you think back, that you had to figure out how to balance on the bike. And that for those of us that like to pedal with both pedals, which I think is probably everyone in the room, that when you pedal both those pedals, that's when you gain the most momentum. And if you only pedal one of those pedals, it's harder to gain momentum, and it's quite difficult, right? And that when it comes to leadership, oftentimes we unintentionally pedal only one pedal. And here's what I mean by that. Those of us that are task-focused, raise your hand if you're a task-oriented person versus, are you a task-oriented person versus relationally oriented? So a task-oriented person, the way they're wired is they're going to get through those steps and they're going to make things happen. And you're probably going to equip the person really well in the role that you're asking them to do. So the task-oriented person is going to make somebody really successful in facilitating a small group or overseeing a team in a particular role that you've asked them to do. So if you're task-oriented, that's the pedal that you're used to pedaling on that bike of development. If you're relationally oriented, raise your hand if you're relationally oriented. If you're relationally oriented and you're more pastoral and you're more about pouring into the person's life, more about their story, you're probably going to be really good at talking about their marriage, talking about their dating life if they're single, talking about what it means to be single, talking about their job, and about things that are going on in their life. And those of us that are relationally oriented, we're going to be really good at pedaling that pedal of development when you're apprenticing with somebody. I'd like to suggest that it takes both. And it really does take the art and science. And the art is the relationship. The science is the task-oriented person. And again, that's just what we've seen over and over again. And the first step is you admitting that you have a bias. And that's okay. Like you're gifted and wired that way. It's part of your narrative. It's part of your story. It's the way that you function as a leader within God's kingdom. That if you're like me and you're relationally oriented, you're going to have a bias towards just building the relationship and building it really strong and tight, and you're pouring into their life. You probably have no problem putting on your calendar and getting together on a regular basis with this apprentice leader. For those of you that may be more task-oriented, you're going to be great at making sure that they're fully equipped to take on this responsibility. And that is an important part of raising somebody up into leadership. If you're asking them to be apprenticed to oversee a tech team that runs the sound and runs media and runs the back end of the Sunday morning experience, certainly you want them to be equipped to do that effectively. You don't want the lights going off in the wrong place and the sound being funky on a Sunday morning. You want to make sure they understand the skills that it takes to lead in that particular ministry if you're asking them to oversee the tech team. In the same way, if you're asking them to lead a support recovery group, a 12-step group, a divorce care group, a grief share small group, you certainly want them to be effective on the skills that it takes to lead that type of environment. That's really important. And so for those of us that are more task-oriented and to have that as a particular skill set, you're awesome to the kingdom. You're an absolutely necessary component. However, the dark sides of those, if you're relational and all you are is relational, you may not get to the part where you have to teach them how to do what you're asking them to do. And they can find out that when they get on the other side of it and you've eventually let them step into leadership, they can find themselves in over their head and overwhelmed. And they show up at that 12-step group and they don't know how to facilitate a difficult conflict in the meeting. Or they show up on a Sunday morning and they don't know how to manage what happens on the back end of the service, and things don't function the way that you'd hoped, and the excellence factor goes way down. Because you didn't necessarily get to some of the skill side of things of what it means for them to step into leadership. And then if you're task-oriented and all you are is task-oriented, you may never get to asking them how they're doing in the relationship with Jesus. You may never get to asking them how they're doing in terms of generosity and tithing and financially sacrificing for God's kingdom. You may never get to how they're doing with their marriage, how they're doing with purity issues, how they're dealing with their relationship with Jesus. And that relational side of apprenticeship is just as important as the task side, which is kind of why we use that kind of bicycle analogy. If you want to gain the most momentum, if you want to gain the most traction in the development of a leader, we believe that you have to have the art and the science of those things working together. So here's how we do that. We equip our leaders to have 2 conversations on a regular basis. The science side, or the task side, so those of you that are task-oriented, you're going to like this, are what we call the 5 steps. And the 5 steps of apprenticeship really translate into any ministry at any level of leadership. And we use it from, and I'll talk about this later, we use that from the apprentice leader in a small group, apprentice leader in a team, all the way up to what we call a movement leader who oversees networks of churches. So this leadership path, which I'll talk about after I'm done with this section here, this 5-step of apprenticeship translates in any context of leadership. Let me give you the 5 steps. And if you read Exponential, you've seen them, but I'm going to flesh them out for you. So the first step is I do, you watch, we talk. I do, you watch, we talk. And it's in this first step. Imagine you're in small group with me. Who's the young lady with the glasses to my left? Raise your hand. What's your name?
Carrie.
What is it?
Carrie.
Carrie. Carrie, that's my sister's name. That's a great name. I was always confused. My parents would yell our names when they'd get mad at us. Say, "Oh, Carrie sounded like Eric." And I always be like, who are you talking to? Who are you mad at today? Yeah. Carrie, good to meet you. Yeah, right. So Carrie, you're my apprentice leader. Welcome aboard, Carrie. Thanks for saying yes. So Carrie is in my small group. I've asked her to become my apprentice leader, and Carrie is going to apprentice with me. And over the life of her apprenticeship, which could be as short as 6 weeks, could be as long as 18 months, that all depends upon her spiritual journey. It depends upon her capacity, depends upon her schedule and what she's ready for, depends upon the life stage of the small group. There's a lot of factors that play into Carrie and her apprenticeship. But she has said yes to apprenticeship, and so she's taken the first step of the 5 steps. I'm leading small group on Tuesday nights. Carrie's in that group, and she's going to watch me facilitate discussion. She's going to watch me do the prayer time. She's going to watch me make great jokes. She's going to watch me facilitate the experience that's going to take place on Tuesday night. So I do, she watches, and then we're going to talk about it, which really is the most important part. Carrie and I are going to meet on a regular basis, and it may be once a week. It could be once a month. It all depends upon maybe what I think would be most helpful to her as my apprentice leader. And certainly that would be a conversation. So like my guy, Brett, that I met with this morning, who used to be my apprentice leader, who now is a small group leader, he and I would meet every single week. And it's partly because I felt like he needed that. He even admitted that he wanted that. And so we met every single week. Carrie and I, we may meet once a month because I think she's a rock star. She's got tremendous capacity and she's going to grow fast. And our frequency maybe doesn't need to be as high. Or maybe we meet every week because she has all those same characteristics and I see that she could start a group in 6 weeks. Either way, we talk. And that's part of our experience. And that is the first step. The second step is I do, you help, we talk. And this is the stage where Carrie is going to take on some responsibility in the small group on Tuesday nights. And she is going to do, let's say, the icebreaker and maybe the prayer time. And I'm going to lead the bulk of the discussion and the bulk of the experience. And this is the stage where we're going to get together and we're going to talk about that. I'm going to say, wow, Carrie, like, you were a rock star. Great job. You did an awesome icebreaker. I loved it. And the prayer time you facilitated was stellar. Fantastic. The other thing I'm going to model for Carrie is I'm going to ask her how I did. And I'm going to give her an opportunity to speak into how I did as a leader, because I'm modeling for her teachability, which is one of the core characteristics of apprenticeship. A couple of weeks are going to go by. We're going to continue to do that, but then we're going to move into the second step, which is, can you guess what it is?
I do. You want? You do. I do.
Close. So you do. I'm going to help. Okay? I'm going to help. And so what that means is that you're going to own the discussion time, Carrie, and I'm going to do the prayer time and the icebreaker. And then we're going to get together. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to give you feedback. You're going to give me feedback. I'm going to model teachability. And all that's going to be stellar. We're going to do that for a couple of weeks. And then eventually, we're going to move to the fourth step, which is the one you just said. The fourth step is you're going to do. I'm just going to watch. And then we're going to talk about it. Now, what's great is the small group all this time, they know this is taking place. We've announced that you're the apprentice leader. They've been able to observe you grow in your leadership. And we're going to get to see all that take place on Tuesday night, where you lead the whole experience. You facilitate the whole thing. And it's going to be awesome. Like, the group's going to be like, wow, look at Carrie. She's just continuing to grow in her leadership. And we're beginning to trust her as a spiritual leader. And we can't wait for the next step. It's going to be fantastic. She's going to start her own small group, or she's going to take over this existing group. And the last step is you do, someone else watches. And this is where you've been able to step into a leadership role, bring an apprentice leader with you, or identify a new apprentice in that existing group, and eventually you see generations of multiplication take place. Now, what I like about the 5 steps, as I said earlier, this can apply to a team, this can apply to a group, this can apply to a staff member taking on a new role. We use this 5-step of apprenticeship for apprenticing church planters as they start new churches. We use it at every level, in every ministry, everywhere. And the science of the 5 steps translates to everything. In fact, the Apprentice Field Guide, which is something that I oversaw the development of, is a tool that we wrote that is not only used in a local church and not only has been translated into about a dozen different languages, it's used by nonprofit organizations, by profit organizations, because it's just a very simple methodology of reproducing yourself as a leader. And those 5 steps, they just work. They just absolutely work. They're very simple, and they're very practical, and they're reproducible. So that's the task, I think. Let's give it up for Carrie for being a good apprentice leader. She did it. All right, so the relational side. The relational side is the other pedal. And we know that if we want to gain the best momentum, we do what? We pedal both pedals. And so if we're going to pedal both pedals and we're going to get at relationships, those of us that are task-oriented, we need to move over and make sure we're doing the other side. The relational side, we use a simple acrostic or an acronym that we call RPMs. And RPMs stands for relational, physical, mental, and spiritual. Relational, physical, mental, and spiritual. Inspired by Luke 2:52, where we read about how Jesus grew up in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and men. You can look at that particular verse and you'll find relational, physical, mental, and spiritual in that particular verse. Relational stands for their relational world. If they're married, how are they doing with their marriage? If they're single, how are they doing with being single? And if they're dating, how's their dating life? How's their job and their relationships with people they work with? How are they doing at being on mission and being evangelistic and inviting people into the Jesus mission? How are they doing in their relationship with their neighbors, in their relationship with other kids, parents at school, if they have a family, just all that stuff. How is their relational world? P stands for physical. So how are they doing with their schedule, their pace of life, their health, their physical? How are they doing with their sleep schedule, their physical world? And we should be asking those questions. Those are important things to ask, their health. M stands for mental, which is how are they doing with studying the culture around them so they can be relevant with the gospel? How are they doing at staying engaged with what's going on in our world? How are they doing at stretching their minds in terms of their spiritual depth? Are they reading other books? Are they looking at blogs? Are they following people on Twitter? Are they paying attention to what's going on? Are they filtering things from their mind that they should be filtering from their mind. How are they doing with that? And then spiritually, which is the one we tend to err on the most, which obviously is incredibly valuable, but I would encourage all four of those are equally valuable, or the other three, I should say. But the spiritual would be how they do in their relationship with Jesus, in their relationship with the church, in relationship to their generosity, fasting, praying, meditation on scripture, studying God's word, all those things that help us grow spiritually. And part of what it does with the RPMs, I mean, honestly, like one way to think about it is if you're task oriented, do one of each when you get together. Talk about their relational world. And then the next time you meet up, talk about their physical. Next time you meet up, talk about their mental and talk about their spiritual the next time. And if that's helpful to help kind of process that, for those of us that are more relationally wired, we may not even need that. Like it may not even be that important because we're already kind of wired to think about those things anyway. And what we need instead is we need to look at those 5 steps and be intentional about transferring the responsibility that we're asking people to do once they're done with apprenticeship development. And I just gave you a whole bunch of information, and I'll go ahead and just do a Q&A with that part. What are some questions or comments you have about apprenticeship and the development of an apprentice leader? If you want to toss out some thoughts or questions along those lines.
I just have a question. So thank you. That was great. Do you ever, your example was one-on-one. Do you ever do that like in a group setting, multiple?
Yes. Okay. Yes, thank you. Absolutely. We actually have a tool that we wrote called a Small Group Leader Field Guide. And the Small Group Leader Field Guide is a tool that you can use individually or you can use with a group of leaders. We call those turbo small groups.
When you work with church leaders, existing churches, how hard is this for, this is a really big question, but how hard is it for existing leaders to retrofit and retool for this approach?
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I do think it's actually pretty incredibly difficult. Most of us as pastors have been trained that our job is to lock ourselves in a room for 20 hours to 25 hours a week and write a message. And then if we're lucky, we might do some hospital visits. And then that's like the job of a pastor. And I would like to suggest that maybe it's different than that. Maybe what we should find instead on our calendars, if we were to look at our weekly schedule, like if you were to look at my schedule, that it really should be a whole bunch of one-on-ones with people that we're developing and pouring into so that they in turn can develop and pour into others. And that you should be able to look at your calendar and say, okay, about half my week is dedicated to meeting with people one-on-one to raise them up as leaders. And if that's not the case, then that's maybe not the best use of your time. I would kind of challenge, I guess. So I think when pastors hear that, like they go, well, I don't know how I would even do that. How would I do that? You know, and they kind of feel overwhelmed by their schedules already. And they're not sure how to pull that off. And I guess I would suggest it probably requires a shift of priorities and probably shifting the culture of expectation of your staff. And it's not the best analogy, but sometimes I'll use the analogy. It's a little bit like sales, like in the business world. Like if you're sitting at your desk, you're not doing your job. And I would almost argue that might be true of us as pastors. Like if we're going to create a leadership development culture and a raising up of apprentice leaders and a raising up of volunteer coaches who oversee leaders, and if we're going to create a multiplying church, I'd say that our calendars probably need to be filled with meeting with people one-on-one on a regular basis. That would be kind of my, yeah, that's a good question. Were you asking that just thinking of your own context or thinking of other church contexts that you're aware of?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
Leaders that I work with and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. Like probably what has helped me with it the most, honestly, it's partly how I'm wired, but it's also to see the fruit in it. I mean, I got a long list of people that over the last 17 years that have been able to start new churches and come on staff here at Community that I had the privilege of sitting across the table from and saying, hey, I see in you these things. I don't know if you see them or not, but I see them in you. And I'd love for you to trust me on this journey as we follow Jesus together, and let's see what God does with that. And when you get to see the fruit of that, you're like, oh, man, there's nothing else I'd rather do with my time. This is the best thing I've ever done. So that's a good question, though.
Hi, Eric. I'm off screen. Sorry for you, but
No worries.
Fifth task side piece, you do somebody else watches. Is that how fluid does that stuff come relative to the others for people? Does that tend to be a little stickier getting into it, or do they roll into it pretty easily?
Which particular part? So them transitioning from apprentice to leader, is that the part you're talking about?
Yeah, to where they find sort of the next apprentice, if you will.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say for some people it's easier for them than others. It probably just depends upon their gifting and their wiring. If you could think of it as like a scale, some people, when it comes to those three must-haves, relational intelligence, teachability, and spiritual velocity, for some people, they'll be like a 10 out of 10 on those characteristics. For others, they're like a 5 out of 10. Like they've got them, but they're not quite as high. I'd say that plays a part sometimes in their effectiveness of getting an apprentice leader. I have a gal who's just like, she's got all three characteristics, and she is just a home run. She's a grand slam. And she's already launched her small group. It's full already. She's got 2 apprentice leaders. She has another guy that's asked to become her apprentice. And she's our prototype. If I could just reproduce that over and over again, it'd be easy. But then you'll have other people who struggle with it. They're not quite as successful at it, and they need you to come alongside of them. And they need you to point out that potential apprentice leader for them. And they need you to give them the language on how to ask that person into apprenticeship. And they need you to kind of encourage them when they hit the wall in their small group. And they need you to help them walk through those stages. I feel like we need room for both of those types of leaders. Like we need room for both. Because if all we're looking for, is the rock star who gets it all the time, then there wouldn't be room for people like me at the table. Like I needed somebody to walk me through all that stuff. I needed somebody to encourage me along the way. I wasn't perfect at it when I first started, and I'm still growing as a leader. So like, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Yes, thank you.
We've got someone way off screen. Come over this way.
Come on in.
There we
Big
go.
smile.
Hey, good morning.
Oh, look at this. Hi.
My question is, this field guide, was that in place before you got to your church? Or were you instrumental in writing that?
So it was not in place. And there was nothing in writing anywhere when I came to community. And I was here for about 5 or 7 years. And I was asked to lead a task force that was called Who's Next. And the reason why I was asked to do that was because community was slacking off in terms of apprenticeship. And I'm the one that blew the whistle and said, hey, I think that's a problem for us. I think we need to fix it. I was the small group ministry director at the time. And I said, we had about 28% of our groups that had apprentices. That's not nearly high enough. And so the lead pastor asked me if I'd be willing to help solve that problem. And so we built a task force that we wrote the apprentice field guide, and then we delivered that as new content to all of our leaders. And the cool part is, because we already had a reproducing culture, we quickly went from like 20-some% to like 75% within like 3 to 4 months. And that apprentice field guide was a huge catalyst for that. That was a big thing. Just educating our people on the language and all that kind of stuff.
I'm really interested in how, like you said, you're very relational, and I'm very strategic and task oriented. And I'm wondering what that looked like.
Okay.
It's brilliant how you can communicate to both people. And I'm just wondering a little bit about that process.
Sure. So we have a gathering that I haven't talked about that we call Leadership Community. And Leadership Community is a monthly gathering of all of our leaders, apprentices, coaches, staff, and any key volunteers that want to be at it. And at Leadership Community, we cast vision about what it means to be one church, multi-site, helping people find their way back to God, which is our mission statement. And then we celebrate new leaders there as well. We have a goofy parody that we do. It's a new leader song where we'll take a pop song that's on the radio or an old 80s song. And it's just a really fantastic experience, quite honestly. And we do that together as a church 2 or 3 times a year. And then multi-site, we do it at our campuses the rest of the time of the year. And it's at that gathering leadership community where we're like pumping vision and we're giving plans and we're giving strategies and we're providing training. And that's where we kind of mass distributed these apprentice field guides. And that helped us to kind of sync up on the conversation. If you don't have that type of environment, it makes it much harder to kind of get everybody on the same page and create some momentum.
Was there one person on the original task force that was really instrumental in doing this task-oriented language, or was it a collaborative type, this is just what came out of that?
Community already had that, actually. The 5 steps, we already had that. So when I came to community, that was already some of the language that was around us. It wasn't quite as clear as the RPMs, quite honestly. We talked a lot about relational, physical, mental, and spiritual, and leadership expectations. And like we were probably using that language more so than we were the 5 steps. And the whole bicycle analogy, that came out of us just trying to figure out how to talk about it, and realizing that people lead with a certain bias and we need both. And so how do we bring more balance to it? And so the whole bicycle thing kind of came out of the dialogue, and we just ended up sticking with that language, and it's found its way into everything we talk about now. Yeah. And actually, I don't know if Stan, I can share the Apprentice Field Guide with you and you can share it with everybody else if you'd like. Just if it's helpful. And then if you want to buy hard copies of it, I can send you the link and where that stuff's at.
Great, yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions.
I'm going to sit right here with Peter. This will be quick. All right. Yeah. So you describe yourself as a relational person. That's how I am.
Yeah.
That's my strong suit.
Okay, good. I can relate.
Which means, okay, so this is the downside for me. I suck at conflict. I suck at difficult conversations. And so I'm thinking about people with spiritual velocity, teachability, and what was the third one? So relational IQ. So I've had interns. We recruited people for ministry tasks. We get partway in, and we realize, oh, okay, this is they're not a 10. Okay, they're a 7, a 4, and what do you know, a 3. Okay, how do you have, as a relational person who knows the cost and he knows the fallout and he knows people are going to go sideways on you? How do you do that? How do you have conversations about this?
Yeah, that's fair. I think.
How do you do that? How do you do that without sounding like you're some big know-it-all? Because I know I'm not perfect either. And so I feel very tentative in those situations. Okay, that's my question.
That's great.
You handle that conflict well.
That's fantastic. I love it. I had no idea that this was what was going to take place here on video. I could make more awkward jokes, but I'll stop there. So, okay. So part of what is important, I think, is language. Language creates culture. Okay. And culture creates movement, and there's lots of good things that come from that. So a language that I use a lot and that we use a lot at community is that when you invite somebody into apprenticeship, you're inviting them on a journey. And I think that language says that we're going on a journey together. Okay. And this is a leadership journey. And at the end of this journey, you may or may not step into leadership. And it's because there's a lot of factors that play into this. It could be that you don't feel like you're ready yet. It could be that you're too busy. It could be that you're not willing to jump in with Jesus all the way. And when you're done with this journey, you may or may not become a leader. And I just want to tell you out loud, this is what I'll say to somebody. It's okay. Like, it's totally okay. It's okay if you're not ready. We have no problem with you not being ready yet. We would much rather for us to say out loud that you're not ready yet, and for you to say you're not ready yet, than to put you into a leadership role and regret it. And so part of it is like we try to make sure that language is like infused through the whole journey as an ongoing conversation the whole time. And we do the same thing at the church planter level. Like if someone comes in and they do a leadership residency with us, there's a lot more at stake there for them because they've raised support, they've moved their family, they've gotten, all the stuff they've done to come to Chicago to be trained and equipped to start a new church. But I still say from the very beginning, like, hey, you know what? Like, this is a journey. You're coming to see if we like, or if you like us and if we like you. And if in the end we feel like we like each other and we feel like God's blessing it and you feel like God's leading you to do it and we feel like you're doing it, we're going to launch this new church. But if anywhere along the journey you don't feel like it's being a good fit, and I don't feel like it's a good fit, and we don't think you're ready, and you don't think you're ready, and we don't feel like God's blessing it, it's okay. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And so part of it is maybe trying to create a culture where failure is an option. In fact, it has to be an option because, and going back to the parable of the talents, it's not about whether you're successful or not. It's about whether you risked the talents you have or not. And as far as like the hard conversations you talked about, I totally understand. Like I hate them. I don't really want to have any hard conversations with people. I'd rather just have fun together. And anytime I find out about somebody doing something that's not a part of God's plan, I had one just a couple of weeks ago where I have somebody who's leading a small group that's just making some really dumb choices. And because I know you won't talk to the person and you don't know who I'm talking about, I'll tell you what it is. It's a young professional who has just gotten into college and they're also working a full-time job, and they're drinking and they're not of age and they're leading a small group for me. And I don't have any tolerance for that. I have no problem with alcohol. In fact, I like alcohol. But like, I have a problem with somebody drinking underage and trying to lead within the church. And so like, we had to have a conversation with them, and I was not excited about that, but I know that we needed to. And so we had the conversation with them, and we've taken some steps in that's been actually really healthy and very good. But I had to remind myself of what's the alternative, and what are the potential ramifications of keeping them in that role while they're doing the things they're not supposed to be doing. And I suppose I would say the same thing about the interns, and I would say the same thing about somebody in an apprenticeship. Like, I don't want to get on the other side of it and have not had those hard conversations. Now I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop talking. That's a fair question. It's not easy, I know, but I always try to imagine the potential of the end result. I guess I thought of one quick story with that just briefly. So we had somebody who was in apprenticeship. They were not the right person to step into leadership. Okay. And that was decided by the leader. It was decided by me as the coach. I was coaching small groups at the time. And this person was a small group leader that I oversaw. And they had somebody in apprenticeship that we didn't feel like was going to be an effective leader. So they had to have that conversation with them. So they did. They said, hey, I love you. We said all along this was a journey, and we don't think that you stepping into leading a small group is the right next step. This person became very upset over that. So then I chose to meet with them as the coach, taking Matthew 18 into account, looking at our care structure, realizing there was some conflict between a leader and apprentice. I chose to, as the coach, to step in, to be involved in this conflict. So I met with this individual, and here's what I explained to him. I said, look at it this way. It's kind of like a scale. On one side, you have all your kind of baggage and sin and things that are keeping you from being ready to lead. And then you have all these gifts. And I feel like it's unbalanced right now. Like, I want to see your gifts expand God's kingdom. I want to see you lead other people spiritually, but your baggage and your sin that's in your life right now is far outweighing your strengths. And here's what I mean by that. And I went on to explain the things that I saw in them that were keeping them from being a spiritual, godly leader. The person just starts crying, and they become very emotional. And I thought it was because of what I had said. And turns out it was, but not what I had thought. She goes on to say, no one has ever told me that. No one has ever been that honest with me. Nobody has ever been that transparent with me about what they see in me and the things that I need to improve upon. And she's like, thank you so much. And then she goes on to say, I've been handed from one ministry to the next over and over and over, and I never knew why. And you're the first person that's ever told me why. And then she was like, thank you so much. And then she started talking out loud with me, where do you think I could serve? What do you think that would look like? And she became very involved in our tech ministry, not in a leadership role, and she loved it. And she finally found the place where she felt like she could contribute and built some friendships through that. She stayed in that small group. She continued to be discipled by this small group leader. And it was great. And it was awesome. Now, I tell you that story to say that not every story turns out that way, but it did. And it was pretty cool to be a part of that. So